Welcome to this web series, The Frugal Mindset, also known as Money and the Responsible Christian. This is the introduction to this series, and we will discuss wisdom and perspective. Hi, I'm Lee Henning. My wife Sandy and I married when we were 19 years old, and as I always say, I've been married more than my entire adult life. I was an immature 19-year-old when we got married, and now I'm an immature nearly 70-year-old. We were full-time college students with part-time jobs, and a baby interrupted our plans. And no, I'm not claiming an immaculate conception. When we were in law school, we were really poor. We were living on $600 a month. If you want to hear more about my background and my qualifications to teach this class, I have a separate segment called Lee's Qualifications. You can catch that if you want. A while ago, I was asked to teach a class about financial skills. And I read a whole bunch of stuff and skimmed a bunch of stuff about money management, including several of Dave Ramsey's books. And universally, they talk about budgeting. And I spent a number of months planning and thinking about it really before I started writing. And I turned to Sandy one day, because there was all this talk about budgeting. I turned to Sandy one day and I said, honey, have we ever budgeted? Remember, we've been married nearly 50 years. And she kind of crossed her head for a second and thought about it, and she said, no, I don't think we ever budgeted. And I couldn't think of it either. And I think what we decided is when we were first married, we were so poor we couldn't afford to budget. And then later, when I became a successful lawyer, I couldn't afford to budget either because my income varied wildly from one year to another, sometimes more than 300% from one year to the next. So while we did at times buy some expensive things, other than a home, we paid cash for everything because we didn't know if we could ever afford payments. In the process of planning the class, I also spoke with a number of other people. And one of the people I spoke with was my son, Josh. And I asked Josh about the topic and frugality and things like that. And he said, Dad, frugal is a state of mind. And I thought that was a great point. And from those conversations and our life experiences, we came up ultimately with the 4 frugal questions and the 3 need questions, which we discuss in the second main segment of this webinar, called the Frugal Mindset. And it's really an alternative potentially to budgeting. And as I thought about the approach to the webinar further, I realized that perspective was critical to understanding money in our society today and having a proper attitude about money. From that perspective came the first portion of this webinar, which I call Money and the Responsible Christian. And that segment is all about the big picture. It's about money, wealth, poverty, the statistics, and the biblical perspective. Finally, there's a third section of the webinar, kind of a catch-all, where I talk about many financial and frugal tips. In the series, we'll touch on psychology, sociology, accounting, singles and couples counseling, finance, economics, investing, and the law, and a whole lot of Jesus. Each segment will be short, from 5 to 15 minutes long, and many of the principles I'm going to discuss would help anybody regardless of their religious perspective. But my point of view is definitely a Christian perspective, and I will quote the Bible often when I feel it's appropriate. I want to talk just a minute about wisdom and perspective. So what does wisdom have to do with perspective? What does perspective have to do with wisdom? Absolutely everything. First of all, the Bible isn't one book. It is 66 separate books, 39 in the Old Testament and 27 in the New Testament. It was written over a period of about 1,600 years by 40 different authors. And the Bible discusses money, wealth, poverty, those kinds of topics over 2,000 times. I want to talk for just a minute about something the Bible says about wisdom. Let's read from Proverbs 1 through 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Let's focus on that last segment. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. I think universally people desire to have a life of meaning. Some people try to find value in being famous. Others try to find meaning in being wealthy or in having pleasure. Some try to find value in service to the planet or animals or service to other people. But I would suggest that to have a life of value and meaning must start with understanding your role in the universe. And to understand our role in the universe, we must compare our role with God's role. God, who spoke the universe into existence, versus my life, a puff of mist that appears in the morning and is gone by noon. Let's discuss another passage about wisdom. This is a promise from James chapter 1, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. There are 10 topics I plan to cover in this first section of the webinar. They are poverty, wealth, generosity, tithes and offerings, warnings about riches, consumerism, greed, the prosperity gospel, the question, why aren't there more rich Christians? And finally, anxiety and contentedness. All right, thanks for listening.